All right, thanks for coming. This is Science on Tap number 2. I'm going to not be as long in the mouth as I was last time, and get right to our talk tonight because he says he has a lot to talk about. So we'll get there. I think there's a couple things I do want to mention. My name is Sean Devlin. I'm from the bio station. I'm a postdoc there. My wife Hillary is the outreach and education coordinator for the Lakers. So I'm going to give a couple, I have to do a little spiel to start with so that we can get things crossed off my list here, and then we'll get started. We'll get to some interesting conversation and discussion about trout in the Flathead Valley. One note about the sort of format, it's really relaxed and laid back. Enjoy beer. Every beer you buy tonight, $1 goes to the Lakers and the bio station to be split. So it's a fundraising event as well as hopefully a great time. There's right off the bat, I'd like to ask and offer or I guess make known that we have envelopes out on the tables. If you're not a Flathead Lakes member, you should look at these envelopes and really consider becoming one. As well as there's lots of information strewn about regarding the bio station and what we do there. I assume folks are here because they like fish. There's a fish list that you can peruse and see if you've seen these fish before. There's a lot about what's happened in Flathead Lake in the fisheries community, and have a look at the information that's about. And if you have any questions, there's lots of board members and members of the Lakers as well as biostation employees here tonight. Feel free to pull us aside and ask any questions you have, or if you have any discussions or any points you want to make. If anybody's seen Kokanee out there, come and talk to me. I think there's one thing I want to do. Is Clint hiding? Where did he go? I gotta put my beer down for this. Hold on. I'd like to present Clint with a map. Could you open that up and show it off for folks? Maybe try to do the tape without tearing it. The biostation has put together a new map. Diane has been instrumental in putting this map together. I think it's amazing. I don't know if anybody's seen it. You're about to, so hold on to your hats. Diane will be selling these maps. They're $20 a piece, and they're pretty incredible. I mean, I can find my driveway on there. That's how highly resolved it is. It's a really beautiful map. It's I think it's a long time coming from what I've heard around the station. So these will be available for sale. Please talk to Diane if you're interested in one. I suggest you get one or two. If you're late with a Christmas present, you can save the day here. But Clint, this is a token of our appreciation for your participation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have one last little announcement. I'm going to hand the mic over to Mark Johnston, who will talk about a film, Johnston, and a film event. So he knows a lot more about it than I do.
Thanks, Sean. I'm Mark Johnston. I'm one of the board members of the Flathead Lakers, a newly appointed board member. And I wanted to point out on this table here, there's a brochure, a little flyer for the Flathead Lake International Cinefest, which is the 22nd through the 24th of this month in Polson. It's a 3-day international film festival, and the Flathead Lakers are sponsoring 2 films in the film festival. Both of them are showing on Saturday, the 23rd. The first one is about the bomb trains, the crude oil trains from the Bakken that travel along the North Fork and all the way to the Pacific Northwest. As Jack Stanford said last month, it poses the most immediate threat to the Flathead Lake watershed. So one of the films on Saturday afternoon will be related to that. And then the second one is about open water swimming, and the filmmakers from California are coming from California for the screening of the film. And I'm an avid open water swimmer, and I'll be facilitating the discussion as well. But it's a film called Driven, about kids from the age of 13 all the way up to kids the age of 30 trying to swim across the Catalina Channel from Catalina Island to the mainland of California. So it's kind of an interesting topic, as open water swimming in Flathead Lake is also growing and kind of dear to my heart. So if you have a chance, pick up one of these flyers and participate in the screening of the events that the Flathead Lakers are supporting. Thank you.
Okay, so I tried to be as quick as I could with all that stuff. I'll remind you quickly about the format tonight. We're going to have however long Clint can talk, which maybe a while, where he gives a little introduction about his work, and then we'll have some time for questions and some time for discussion, general discussion around the room. I would offer that if you were here last time, we had a long pause while folks drained their glasses and then empty glasses stood around. So we're going to try and offer some breaks and get the waitstaff in here to fill beers up and take orders as needed. So if they're mingling about, please make room and try and facilitate people getting as many beers as they need. And keep in mind, every beer, we get $1. So drink up. So I'll introduce Clint Muhlfeld now. He is a researcher, an associate research professor. Is that the correct title at the biostation? So he's affiliated with the biostation, he's actually probably our biggest fish scientist at the biostation right now, and he also is a part of the USGS station up in West Glacier. So he has done a lot of work on salmonids and trout in the Flathead Valley, and has gotten quite a bit of I'd say hot press lately in terms of his work, and he's going to talk about flathead trout in hot water. So without further ado, here's Clint. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Awesome. If anyone wants to excuse themselves and get more beer, feel free. This is supposed to be an informal talk, and I purposely took out all my my data slides. So that's really tough for me to do as a scientist. So, but I couldn't just sit up here and just lip smack for an hour or so. I have to show some pretty pictures of how awesome and beautiful the Flathead is, and what a pleasure it is to work and live here and enjoy our recreational and native trout fisheries here in Montana. I'm going to talk tonight about climate change and what we do know about it and what we don't know about it, and ask the question to the science and ask the question to the public: are trout in hot water in the Flathead? We've heard a lot these days about gloom and doom stories about climate change, that waters are going to increase in temperatures, flows are going to decrease. We're certainly seeing that in the data. But really, can these trout adapt? Have they adapted to persist in an ever-changing climate for millennia, undergoing tremendous environmental variation, from flooding to wildfires to glaciation to extreme drought events to elevated temperature events? These trout have persisted on this landscape for at least 14,000 years, surviving these cataclysmic occurrences. So my contention tonight is that I'm going to answer that question right now. Trout aren't in hot water. They've proven themselves to adapt and persist here in the Flathead, and this is one of the most unique systems out there where these fish have a chance. So the title of my talk is Trout in Hot Water. I put a question mark at the end because I'd like to hear back from you at the end of this discussion about what you think about the status and what the future holds for these iconic fishes of the Northern Rockies. I took that previous picture in a dewatered section of Holy Creek 2 years ago. It was following a summer with no precipitation for 2 months. It was an awesome spring runoff. We had great snowpack. We didn't have any precipitation for 2 months straight, and lo and behold, these gravel bed rivers that are hotspots for biodiversity in the Flathead were drying up. The flow was going subsurface. These fish were stranded. I even found some dead fish on the bank. These fish were waiting to go out to complete their life history to the large river and main stems and the lakes where they grow to maturity, but they were stranded, waiting for a rain event to flush them out into the river system. These are the type of events that are going to increase in frequency and magnitude here in the Flathead, and we've already seen that changing. But these salmonids, like the native cutthroat trout, the Westlope cutthroat shown here in this underwater video I shot this summer, they've adapted to persist under these kind of conditions for millennia. They require cold, clean, complex, and connected habitats to complete their life history to grow, survive, and persist in this landscape. They have enormous cultural value, socioeconomic value. I mean, recreation, hunting, fishing alone in Montana brings in about 240 million annually. They have enormous ecological value. Their value transcends up the food chain into the terrestrial realm, where birds of prey eat them, and bears, etc. So they're key components of the environment, but they require these large, intact, connected, clean, and complex and cold habitats to grow and survive and persist. And it's because of this that they're great indicators of watershed health, ecosystem function and structure. And as trout like this one shown here swim upstream into an uncertain future, what does the future hold for Flathead river bull trout and Westlope cutthroat trout in this ecosystem, which is arguably one of the most biodiverse aquatic ecosystems in North America? UNESCO just did an intensive study where they looked at all these key ecosystems worldwide, and they identified the Flathead in the crown of the continent as one of the most intact and biodiverse aquatic ecosystems in North America and worldwide, for that matter. And at the heart of that is Glacier National Park and the transboundary Flathead River system. This basin has seen tremendous change, but the mid to large size carnivores that are around at the time of Lewis and Clark are still here. They're all represented. All the native fish are still here and represented. And it's because of this convergence zone of these 4 bioclimatic regions that produces this amazing biodiverse landscape that, it's the narrowest point along the Rocky Mountain chain. It's got huge elevational relief, and it's truly the water tower of the continent. Waters flow up to the Hudson Bay, up down the Missouri to the Atlantic Ocean, and to the Pacific Ocean via the Columbia River, Flathead, and through the Flathead. So this is truly the water tower of the continent, and these systems are relatively intact compared to other areas. And you'll hear me say that a lot tonight, because I do want to, make the point that we've got a unique situation here where we've got these vast connections of habitat that are largely protected, and they've got all the suitable components that these fish need to grow and survive in this ever-changing climate. And so we're doing the science from the headwaters all in these alpine mountainous landscapes in Glacier National Park, where rare bugs are on the brink of extinction because there's nowhere to go because of the melting glaciers. We're looking at how these communities might shift as these glaciers recede and these snowmelt patterns change through time and space. And we're trying to understand how these food web dynamics are affecting the entire aquatic interconnected system, all the way from these headwater systems that are relatively intact from these high elevation lakes, like shown here. This is Falcon Lake. It's one of the most remote places in Glacier National Park. I know Jack Stanford's been there and sampled that system, and he beat me to it. Yeah. I'm older than you. Yeah, well, yeah. There's a couple places left out, like Joe Gersh here studying these rare stoneflies below the leading edge of these glaciers. And then we've got these open valley bottoms, these gravel bed rivers that are hot spots for biodiversity, not only for native fish, but for moose and elk and wolves, and you name it. The water here isn't just flowing where you can see it in the surface of the channel. It's flowing out into the floodplain and subsurfacely. So there's a whole host of biodiversity off into the floodplain, in the groundwater, these subterranean stoneflies and caddisflies that a lot of folks have been studying in the biostation up at the Nyack. And these are the biodiverse landscapes and hotspots that are going to be increasingly important in the future as the climate continues to warm. So we've got these interconnected habitats these fish need. You know, we've got this clear, amazing water quality, cold water, it's relatively clean, and because of that, you know, Flathead Lake is one of the most pristine, you know, large body lakes in western North America. We've got these clean gravels that these fish need to spawn in, so they'll make a nest where the embryos incubate. So these are the kind of habitats that are going to be increasingly important as these climates shift and these human dynamics shift through time. And so we're trying to understand, do the science to understand how these changes might manifest themselves through time and across space. Okay, and these cutthroat and bull trout shown here were some of those fish shot in that Oldie Creek pool a couple years ago. I call it a native fish swarm here. I mean, we've got bull trout and juvenile cutthroat. You can see the beautiful par marks on the side of the cutthroat, the vibrant orange or red slash that's indicative of this fish. That's Montana's state fish. And the native bull trout that is the top end predator of the aquatic realm. It's our inland salmon here in the Flathead. These guys migrate hundreds of kilometers back to their spawning and rearing areas using their nose, the scent in the water, to get right back to the stream, to the gravel bed pool that they were born in. So these fish know how to survive in this ever-changing landscape. And because of that, it's truly a native species stronghold, both regionally and range-wide for a variety of biota, like the West Slope cutthroat trout, like the bull trout, like these stoneflies up in Glacier National Park. This is I promise this is the only graph I'll show this entire, but it really, and it's not even mine, so I borrowed it from Kathy Whitlock, but it just shows the past 12,000 years and the reconstructed air temperature trends up here in northern Montana. These trout have been here this whole time, since the Wisconsin period, when the glaciers retreated about 12 to 14,000 years ago. They've survived very cold periods, likely were widely distributed. These lakes were their sources. They radiated out and pioneered areas into headwater lakes and streams and ponds. And there were periods of warm temperatures when they likely retreated to cold headwater streams for refuge under climate, and to deep glacially carved lakes like Flathead, like the Park Lakes on the west slopes of the Continental Divide, to seek out these areas when there was unsuitable temperatures in the river, when there was unsuitable flows for them to survive and grow. So those are the kind of areas they key into as the system changes through time. It's important to note, though, that these fish have proven themselves to adapt and to persist in a changing climate for millennia. Now, we all know the story about Glacier National Park. It's iconic of the combined impacts of global warming and glacial loss. At the end of the last little ice age in 1850, we had 150 glaciers on the landscape in Glacier National Park. Currently, we have 30, 25, some say. Best estimates right now, glaciers are going to be gone, functionally extinct by 2030. In our lifetimes. I hope we all make it. Drink a beer to that one. Glaciers losing its glaciers. So these systems are changing. We've looked at the last 100 years of air temperature trends. They track the increasing trends globally, but the kicker is the rate of warming is 2 to 3 times the rate of the global average. Those are real data that have been collected in the Flathead system. These warm air temperature trends are decreasing the snowpack, decreasing the ice masses in the high country. They're shifting the hydrologic, the flow regime that these fish have adapted to persist with. And they're increasing these disturbance events like fires we've seen in the last couple drought cycles. I mean, look at this last year. Some of the lowest flows on record occurred this year. And the temperatures, namely in June, were some of the highest on record as well. So these are the kind of trends that we're seeing as the climate continues to warm, and it's likely going to compound these other existing stressors that humans have caused on the landscape. When we colonize the area, we have to make a living too. And there's things that we do to the landscape that cause additional harm to these species. And so climate change can't be thought of as a singular threat. It's a synergistic threat that compounds existing stressors like habitat loss, like invasive species. So we can't look at it alone. And it's a very complex system, and these systems have shaped themselves for many, many years. So it's important to know, as we're doing the science on these species, what these species really need for their survival. The bull trout, it's an ESA listed species largely because of habitat loss. When we fragment these rivers due to dams and diversions, we cut off their connections of these critical habitats that they need. I mean, these fish in Flathead Lake, they grow to maturity in Flathead Lake, get day big, they migrate starting in early June. As soon as the spring runoff comes down, they start their upward charge to their right to their spawning areas where they were born. They travel, like up to 250 kilometers right back to the stream they were born in. Juveniles rear a couple, 1 to 4 years. This bull trout was shot in the 80s. That's Tom Weaver. He's the bull trout godfather of bull trout, I call him. And the Flathead, that guy's a legend. He's been studying bull trout forever. And but there's been some changes. These guys require these large, intact, interconnected systems again to complete their life cycle. So these wigwam river fish here traveled all the way from Lake Koocanusa up into Canada to spawn. They don't know these international political boundaries like the Transboundary Flathead or the Kootenai River system. What they do know is how to survive. And so what these bull trout are doing here is staging before spawning. And the cool thing we're learning now, doing the science, what does the science tell us about bull trout? Well, they need all these habitats, but these areas where they're spawning are these giant upwelling zones. So there are these areas that there's groundwater's coming up to the surface and creating really cold temperatures that they can go and key into, lay their eggs. There's great oxygen, it removes the waste products from the eggs, and they hatch and they grow, and they've done this for many, many, many generations. And so these are the little spots on the landscape that are going to be increasingly important as the climate shifts and as other human stressors continue to impact these systems. Like this juvenile bull trout here that, we did a study on the Flathead River. We were doing an in-stream flow study for many years. We were tracking hundreds of fish with radio telemetry. We put these tags in their bellies, track them around, check out what temperatures and flows they were using in the river, because we wanted to inform the dam management and the Columbia Basin Power and Flood Control System. 100 Horse and Libby are major engines of the Columbia Basin system. What we found is that during the day, these bull trout were in these deep, dark habitats. We kept consistently collecting the same data. Whoa, they just need deep water. I guess flow's not really going to affect these species, this species. Well, lo and behold, we started tracking them around at night. As soon as the sun went down at night, boom, they emerged from these deep, dark areas, concealed in the substrate and the wood, and they went out to these shallow shoreline areas where there's a lot of food and whitefish, and they feed there. So those connections are local too. They're not just from the headwaters in Canada all the way down to Flathead Lake. They use the entire system locally as well, from these deep pools to these areas along the shoreline that are affected by dam operations as they jack around flows. So we were able to tell Oregon and Washington and downstream users, hey, we've got some impacts here that we need to worry about. And lo and behold, we've got really good flow regimes now that benefit the main stem of the Flathead River and all the fish that are all along that migration pathway to the lake. So there's good things going on for native fish through the science and just understanding what they need and how they behave, becoming one with the fish. That's what we try to do. I got a grad student. This is another, map, but stream temperatures are warming in the Flathead. But the kicker here is that these streams in the headwaters are going to be suitable. So bull trout, they've dealt with these warm periods. They might just have to change their behavior a little bit to get by. and be able to survive when the river temperatures get up to 70 degrees in the main stem flathead. They might have to seek out those cold water pockets. They're going to become increasingly important. And when that happens too, that the genetic diversity decreases, and that's really important for them to adapt. So we found a very strong linkage between these changes in temperature, high temperatures and low flows and genetic diversity. The flathead, though, is one of the best places where we still have pretty cold water, we've got good flow, and all the forecasts look like we're going to maintain those patterns and those trends through time. So this is an area of refugia, not only regionally, but on the North American continent. We all know the story about invasive lake trout and the community effects in Flathead Lake. I'm sure you've all heard the story there. But these are the threats we need to worry about. These are the threats that are causing 9 of the 12 interconnected lakes to Flathead Lake in Glacier National Park, causing bull trout populations to plummet to the point they're functionally extinct now. And some of these systems in my lifetime, I've counted these spawning nests. They're huge spawning nests. They look like a bomb went off in the substrate in the stream bottom. That's how big these fish are. We go out and count those every year. I've watched these reds, the numbers of reds decline over time in these Glacier National Park lakes. And it's not because of the climate. Glacier's a cold place. It's not because of the climate, it's because of invasive lake trout that directly compete and predate on bull trout and cutthroat trout, and they're causing these major community shifts and the decline of bull trout in the Flathead River system. Well, I told you I wouldn't show any data, but I'll just give you some results of a recent study that we're coming out with. We looked at the effects of lake trout. We looked at climate change. We looked at habitat loss. We did the science and said, okay, what's driving population dynamics? What's causing bull trout numbers to go down? Lo and behold, it wasn't the climate, it wasn't the temperature. It was the lake trout. And guess what? In the system that managers were doing something about it, we saw a positive effect. Those areas where managers were proactive, like in Quartz Lake in Glacier National Park that was recently invaded by lake trout, the USGS and National Park Service partnered on a project there. We tracked these fish to their spawning grounds. They spawned around Halloween at night. You know, we flew a boat in there, and it's the Judas fish approach. We let them lead us to their brothers and sisters and grandmas and grandpas, and we whacked and stacked them. The boys had a blast, and there's plenty of protein on the table at night as well. If we can overfish the Great Lakes, why can't we overfish in the oceans? Why can't we overfish these pothole lakes in the Rocky Mountains where there's nowhere to hide? All it takes is dedication and commitment and the fishing intensity to cause, to tip the balance back to bull trout. And we're seeing those effects in Quartz Lake. The highest red counts on record for the last 2 years. And we've been suppressing lake trout there since 2009. We got there in the nick of time. So there's things we can do, and climate isn't the main driver. It's these other things that humans have affected and that we can sometimes do something about. With the West Slope, same thing. They need these large connected systems. They don't eat other fish like bull trout, they eat insects. So they represent other parts of the landscape that are very important for biodiversity and watershed health. And West Slope cutthroat trout, the leading factor contributing to the decline of this species is hybridization. It's not natural hybridization. That can be a good thing in nature. It's invasive hybridization. It's where we've stocked non-native rainbow trout that haven't evolved in the valley here. And these guys overlap in time and space. They produce offspring, and the hybrids produce hybrids, and they spread. And before long, these genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout are no longer genetically pure. Well, okay, a trout's a trout. Who cares? You know, as long as they behave and they produce like a cutthroat, who cares? I don't care what's on the end of my line. Well, guess what? We did the studies, we did the science, and we looked for the first time at the fitness consequences of hybridization when rainbows are stocked on West Slope cutthroats, when they spawn in the wild, And we found that hybridization, if you allow it to proceed, dramatically reduces their fitness, their ability to survive under environmental change. These genes, individually, and the complexes of genes are linked to how they behave, how they function, how they move in space and time. When hybridization occurs, it breaks those unique genetic linkages. And so these fish don't know how to perform as well. And we've done this in more than one creek, so we're seeing the same patterns. So hybridization is not a good thing in some of the best cutthroat fisheries. Certainly like the Madison and the Gallatin and other areas where cutthroat are long gone and they're up in these headwater areas, yeah, there's a lot of value in those recreational fisheries there. But let me tell you, you look at the range-wide distribution of Westlow cutthroat trout, and we're in one of the strongest regions where we have genetically pure populations left throughout their native range. We have less than 10% of the genetically pure populations that were historically on the landscape left on the landscape, and the vast majority of them are up in the Flathead system. So there is hope for cutthroat in the system if we can do something about it. However, we found that hybridization, if these time bombs, these rainbow sources shown in red here, if we allow them to persist on the landscape, they're like time bombs waiting to go off under the right environmental conditions. Abbott Creek down on the bottom there, we did genetic, over 20 million rainbows were stocked in the valley before 1970. We did genetic inventories on the left there, and we found the vast majority of them were white. They were pure cutthroat. All right, that was back before this major drought of 2003. We resampled those areas. We found that the stream temperatures warmed, and during that drought period, the rainbows massively expanded and hybridized with the Westlow. So literally within a couple generations of fish, because of these sources that were on the landscape, because the hatchery was right upstream of this and leaked fish, they radiated it out and irreversibly corrupted the genes and their genomic makeup, their evolutionary trajectory. Changed it forever. It's irreversible. So these are the kind of changes we're going to see, but there is hope because managers are actually doing something about it. For species like the meltwater stonefly, these might be the first species that go extinct because of climate change. They're up immediately below these melting glaciers in Glacier National Park. They're endemic to Glacier National Park. They're not found anywhere else on the face of the earth except Glacier National Park. They've been petitioned for listing because of climate change-induced glacial and snow loss, just like the polar bear. And they're Glacier's polar bear, I call them. And there's nowhere to go. They're at the top of the continent and it's squeeze play. So they're tracking those cold temperatures and there's nowhere to go at the top of the continent when there's nothing left. In this kind of situation, what do you do? These are the kind of things that are global issues that we might not be able to do much about. So we're gonna have to pick our battles as we improve resiliency and adaptive capacity for these organisms to survive under climate change, like Lednia tamana, the meltwater stonefly, that we find pretty widespread throughout Glacier National Park, right below all the major glaciers. They're doing fairly well, and these other species like Rhyocopola that really no one knows much about. The Western Glacier stonefly, we did 5 years of sampling in the Many Glacier area. This species was documented there in the 70s and 60s. We resampled these areas and associated with major glacial recession. So the pictures don't lie here. You can see the glaciers, the extent of the glaciers on the top in the 1940s. You fast forward 60 plus years later, and you see at least a 40% reduction in glacial mass loss. And so what does the species do that's cold water dependent, that's right at the leading edge of these glaciers? Well, it moves up the system. It retreats to the cold water habitat below the glaciers, and that's what we saw in our data. We resampled these areas, we did the genetics, we did the inventories in the stream, and lo and behold, we found them in 6 streams back in the 60s. I didn't, I wasn't even alive then. And then resampled them more recently and found them in 1 spot. So we know 3 spots, 3 locations that this species persists at. Occupies about a 200 to 300 meter section of stream right at the top of the continent. That's all that we know about that species. So I love Gretzky. I played hockey. I coach hockey. And we got to think out of the box when we're talking about climate change. Should we throw in the towel? Is it all gloom and doom? What do we really know about it? What we do know is that we have in this Flathead some of the last of the best. Truly, on a global scale, on a North American scale, on a regional scale, this is a hotspot for biodiversity. All the critical components are still here. Our native fish are still here. Yes, there's issues. There's issues with habitat. There's issues with invasive species. But these are things that managers can control. And they've been working on, and humans and stewards of the landscape and the riverscape can do as well when you're recreating on the rivers. So we're going to have to take some chances here because we're entering a century that there's going to be extreme events. There's going to be a dynamic disequilibrium, really. And the decisions we make now are going to be more important than ever before for conserving native trout biodiversity here in the Flathead, which is some of the last of the best. And so this is a landscape, in my opinion, on a global scale that there is hope. And people are doing things about it. Yes, there's issues, but all the critical pieces, the evolutionary makeup is still here, and it persists, and it's better than a lot of different places. Managers getting on top of it up in Glacier Park, suppressing lake trout, Swan Lake, they're embarking on it in Flathead. Our data show that you can overfish lake trout if you put your mind to it. Absolutely, and it can benefit bull trout. Managers gone on it when they looked at the hybridization map. When we initially found that source, they started reducing the rainbows and the hybrids, and lo and behold, it's working. Hybridization has slowed. The amount of hybridization in our cutthroat has decreased through time. Managers are doing something about it, and it's working. We published those studies. Looking at barriers in some areas that you just got to put up a barrier. There's invasive species knocking at the door, like in Agricola Creek. So you probably heard about that in the news lately. Well, managers were left with no other decision than to put up a temporary barrier to protect that bull trout population. These are some of the out-of-the-box toolbox things that folks need to think about if we conserve these critical components for future generations to enjoy and appreciate. You know, our work translocating bull trout. This is the first translocation of bull trout in existence, and we did it in Glacier Park, and we did it because the managers were worried about losing their bull trout. Logging Lake, once Glacier's most robust, productive bull trout fishery, and arguably in the Flathead, we're seeing 1 or 2 spawning individuals or 0 spawning adults every year now. So that population is cratered. So what we did with the park is we went in and rescued those bull trout. We did an assessment to look at the suitability of habitat above there and in other areas. And our grad student, designated the Logging Lake system as an area that we can make a go at this. And so we actually moved 135 bull trout over the last 2 years. And guess what? We were in the nick of time. We went back last year with Chris Joyce from NPR, and you can listen to it on the web, check it out. It's kind of a fun story. He missed the wolves howling around the cabin and scratching at the door at night, though. He was super bummed. But anyway, he had a wild experience up in Glacier, but we pounded it trying to find juvenile bull trout to move last year. We found 1. So we got there the previous year, and sure enough, so these things are happening quickly. And it just takes efforts like this where you put fish on the back, species in a bucket, hike them up the trail, and get it done. Working with Canada to protect the Flathead, that was the biggest threat to the Flathead system. We did the science. We showed how important that interconnected habitat is for both bull trout and cutthroat. We showed the amazing water quality. We worked with Canada to do these bioassessments in the Flathead. UNESCO reviewed it, and lo and behold, our country signed an accord where we protected this vast landscape for future generations. That's the biggest conservation effort ever in the history of Flathead. It's the most meaningful thing that's ever been done. to preserve and protect our native fish. Yeah, thank you guys for that. That was a huge effort. Huge effort. That's where the science informed the policy and management, and it took people like yourselves to come to those public meetings and actually voice your opinions and get it done, and they listened. We're working on flows, restoring them. We can use the dams to cool the river. If it gets too warm, hey, why don't we draw from lower down in Hungry Horse, cool the river down? I don't know. Maybe those are things we need to start thinking about. Restoring connectivity in Milltown. They saw amazing results right after they removed that dam, restored the connectivity, the floodplain dynamics of that system. Lo and behold, bull trout are thriving once again in that system. And we're monitoring, as a biologist, as a scientist, we need to keep doing the science to inform the management and the conservation and the policy. So these fish have swam for millennia. They swim in many rivers, streams, ponds, and lakes in the Flathead. And if we give them a chance, and sometimes a helping hand, they'll swim into the future. So thanks so much. Look forward to discussing your thoughts. I think we should take a beer break. I heard last time the well ran dry a little bit. But I want to hear about what you guys think, What do you think the major threats are in the Flathead? Do you think there is hope? Do you think we live in some of the last of the best? And is there hope? So maybe in a couple minutes we can resume discussions and try to answer some of those questions. And I'd love to hear your experiences as well, so we can pass around the mic.
I would just offer that we can take a moment break, but we've been told by the wait staff that the approach is working best in the room. Hang on, folks. If you need a beer, wave to a waitress. Say, hey, I need a beer. Because this went a lot better than last time. So we'll take about a 5-minute break, let Clint catch his breath. All right, folks, let's see if we can quiet down and start asking Clint some hard-hitting questions here. I know there's a few folks out there that I'm sure have some questions for him. Let's put him on the hot seat here, and we'll see what kind of.
Thank you very much.
Or we'll say goodbye. The format here should be just kind of wide open. If you have a question, raise your hand and ask it. I think that's probably the best approach. So let's get started. Don't mind your conversation. We'll get going. And thank you guys for coming. So thanks for sticking around too. We hope this is the part that really gets moving and sort of facilitates some discussion. Again, I'd remind you, if you have any questions about the Lakers or you have any questions about the biostation, please find somebody to ask, and we'd love to talk to you. Thank you very much. All right.
There's a question for you. Yeah. Hey, first off, I really appreciate your enthusiasm. I mean, I'm not a fisherman at all. You make me want to go out and fish and kind of learn about all these things. It's awesome. It's contagious. But I actually do have a question, and I was just wondering, as some of these creatures, like especially the bugs that you were talking about, as they kind of reach the apex of the continent, if they disappear, is there a way that they're preserved like their DNA? And if all of a sudden the climate reversed and the habitat came back, could they be reintroduced as kind of the original species, or are they gone forever? Or is it kind of like a Jurassic Park thing, where we can reinvent them?
Well, first of all, I think I'm surrounded by a lot of trout enthusiasts as well, so it's fun to be in company.
You gotta turn that on.
We heard. Yeah, I've thought about the bug thing a lot. Like, what do you do? This is a global phenomenon. The glaciers are melting. There's some tribes in India that actually go up and tarp their glaciers during the summer, so they still have that in their backyard because that's important to their tradition, their culture. I don't think folks in the U.S. are gonna go to that extreme. So yeah, what do you do when there's nowhere to go and this is the only place they live. One idea would be to do those translocations, actually move them up to Canada or other suitable habitats along the Rocky Mountain spine, and just have some natural, populations that we have something like, these relics, these refugia that we can, hang on to into the future. So that's one idea. We haven't talked to Canada about that one yet, and so I don't know if that'll really work. There's really nowhere else in the U.S., like at least in this eco region. We went over to the cabinets, sampled there. We didn't find them. We actually found Lednia tumana this summer in the Mission Range, which is cool. So we found them outside the park, and we did find them in one drainage in the South Fork of the Flathead, in the Sunburst Glacial Bait. It's not even a glacier. So there's little remnants around. But yeah, that's a great question. What do you do? I mean, you can maybe move them, translocate to suitable habitats. We could bring them into a lab or something like that, but those are extreme measures, and I don't know if folks are going to really buy off on putting that kind of effort forth for a bug. What do you think?
You're the scientist.
I don't know. I mean, I just come up with these mad scientist ideas, but I'm not the typical public that can digest that and think that that's a good expenditure of our tax dollars. So those are difficult decisions for sure, and that's one that might be just more of an educational situation where there's a story to tell with the glaciers in Glacier Park. As people drive along going to the Sun Road, we can have educational booths where we can talk about the bugs and the shifts in the community, because it's not only about individual bugs, it's about the entire community. So yeah.
Well, I think the most inspiring thing about your whole talk was that instead of doom and gloom on global warming, there's some hope that we can get through this, and that our native fish population can survive that, as long as we can, stave off the invasive species issues. And so I thought it was very enlightening that, there's some hope.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's not all gloom and doom, and climate isn't going to get them, and it's the things like the lake trout that they're going to get them in our lifetime. And so, but we're not going to be able to win these battles and pick these challenges in every situation. I brought up pretty good examples of where managers drew the line in the sand and said, okay, yeah, we're going to try it. We're going to try something new, because in the face of uncertainty, in the face of the climate change, projection uncertainties, the uncertainty of how the fish are going to, respond, whether we can, they can survive where we're going to put them. I mean, these are difficult decisions, and sometimes we don't have all the facts. But now's the time, and we're going to have to go out on a limb in some cases and try some new things out of the toolbox to make it happen.
But, stopping the mines in Canada, we're all concerned about the oil trains along the Middle Fork.
Yeah.
I mean, those are issues that hopefully we can control.
Yeah.
The climate, we may not be able to.
Yep, I agree. And I'm glad that point rang through, because I do think there's hope, and it's just back to the basics, really. Yeah.
I was just thinking, probably should just be thinking to myself, but it's a good stout. So, with the bug that's the Glacier Park polar bear,
Yeah.
I was born and raised here. I don't know anything about this bug. I'm almost 40 years old. It's the first time I'm ever hearing it. Would you be willing to be interviewed by the Beacon, and can we make a graphic about this bug, and can we use it to talk about this?
They've done a bunch of stories on it. You can check it out. Tristan Scott.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Maybe I should read the
alpine
Beacon.
ecosystems worldwide, we don't know a lot about them, to be honest. We're sampling streams, like we're bushwhacking for days to get to these little glacial masses that are left, where no one, I would think that not a lot of humans have gone before, and it's pretty exciting to look under the water and sample the bugs and see what's there. And to be honest, we've discovered some new species. You know, I've got an awesome aquatic entomologist, a bug researcher working with me, and he knows every bug, and he's described all these rare bugs. I mean, yeah, he listens to heavy metal and does lab work. But that's what it takes, you know? Yeah.
And do geocaching for to mint stickers.
Yeah.
And you have to learn
But,
something.
you know, luckily, when folks were sampling the region back in the day, they archived the DNA. So we're able to go back and look at changes in where these species are and how their genetic diversity has changed as well. That's another thing I didn't talk about a lot tonight. But as the glaciers recede, we see fragmentation. The populations become isolated. And so they get smaller in population size. The genetic diversity goes down, inbreeding goes up, and that's not a good thing either. So there's all these things that happen as these landscapes kind of fragment. In the mountaintop systems, like I said, you know, there's really nowhere to go. So some of this work is, yeah, you probably haven't heard about them because they haven't been on the news, and the Fish and Wildlife Service got sued recently because they didn't know anything about them. And so we did the science to inform the management. Yeah.
Is the gill netting and the fishing contests in Flathead Lake having any effect on the lake trout numbers?
Well, certainly they're removing fish. So the numbers.
Way to be a politician.
Yeah, right. I don't work for fishing game. I don't work for. No. I just represent the science, so I can talk about the data. Certainly, they're removing fish. Yes. The question is now, are they negatively impacting the growth rate of the population? And so, whenever you want to overfish a fishery, your harvest rate, the rate at which you're removing individuals from the population, has to be higher than the recruitment rate, you know, as they're making babies. Flathead's nowhere near that level. It takes about 50% harvest rate right now with the numbers that are out in the lake, 2-3 million, depending on who you talk to. It's going to take a massive effort to tip the balance on that one. And so, from what I've observed, what data I've looked at, they are not near that level of harvest to negatively impact the population growth rate to cause the population to go, you know, downward. So, not yet.
Influence the fishing game to get on board with the state taking on some of the things that the tribes have taken on. How do you influence them?
Yeah, you tell me. You probably have more influence than I do.
You gotta go to public meetings and yell. Really
Yeah,
loudly.
exactly. Jason knows. Just be loud. Yeah, that's a complex issue. You know, the tribes and the state aren't agreeing on what to do. My concern is that, you know, I didn't show you data today, but our courts data clearly show we're whacking and stacking the lake trout. There's very few individuals left. The bull trout are flourishing. I mean, we've done the science, you know, and we know the numbers that we need to meet to make that happen. So I get concerned, like, about the science and the general public when they look at Flathead and say, well, it's not working.
But not just here. Like
Yeah, or
Yellowstone.
Ponderay are making a good go at it, actually.
You gotta get
So,
those guys on board.
yeah, I mean, if that's what the managers want to do, they need to hit it hard and go home.
What's the fecundity of those fish? Like, what kind of effort would you have to put on them in order to make a difference?
So each female, like, there's about 1,000 eggs per pound of female.
What was their survival rate?
So I mean, their survival rate.
Because they're trying, right? So do they just not understand the impact?
Yeah. So basically, I think what you're asking is, I think that the numbers that they're removing aren't sufficient to cause the population to decline. That's the bottom line.
Has anyone worked out that number?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
What number would they have to remove?
Well, there's different scenarios on what you need to remove through time to get to your target, but I can share some info with you later. I don't want to get all techy and geeky with you on modeling. Yeah, there's a lot of modeling stuff that goes into that. Yeah.
So is there any talk in Flathead like to do what they've done in Yellowstone, where they have had a big impact on the lake trout, where they found their spawning areas and they depth charged them and sound waves to kill the young and kill the eggs off of it? So you talk about happening?
Yeah, that's what we've suggested. I was on the committee to recommend what they should do, and that was definitely one of the recommendations from my shop. We've proven that to be the biggest bang for the buck. You radio tag these fish. For example, in Quartz Lake, they spawn over a 1 to 2 week period right around Halloween, and they went to the base of these 2 avalanche chutes on the north side of the lake, like clockwork. Year after year, they go to these 2 avalanche chutes. And so they all concentrate there. They move in at night, and you go in and lay your net in and remove them, and that's the best way to get them. If you allow those spawners to spawn, then, look, 1,000 bait, offspring per pound of female. I mean, it's just a numbers game at that point. Yeah, Jason.
Clint, you think there's any hope of any sort of shift in the management policy for pike and lake trout at all? Is there any hope at all?
I think there's a lot of good things going on for management around the area, to be honest. Pretty proactive. When you look outside at other management agencies, especially the park, they've got a different
the lake,
mission.
The lake and the lower flathead.
The lower flathead and the lake, in terms of the hybridization problem, they got on it. And
but in terms of pike and lake.
yeah, okay, I'll get there. So they're doing good things there. In terms of the pike, there's nothing going on to reduce the pike population. We did a study back, I think we published it in like 2007 or 8, and we estimated that pike population on an annual basis, I think it's like 30,000 cutthroat and 4,000 to 5,000 bull trout annually. So the native fish have to swim through this gauntlet to get down to Flathead Lake, and these invasive, the pike are there, and they don't care what they eat as long as it's a fish. And sure enough, that's definitely a source of mortality along their migration pathway to the lake. So, but yeah, no, to my knowledge, nothing's being done there. And then we just talked about the lake trout in the Flathead Lake. Again, I think there's insufficient effort there to tip the balance at this point in time. Are they going to ramp that up? That's a question for the tribe or in the states. Really not at the table with them on that one. So, but based on my review of the data, they need to pound it a lot harder if they're going to make a difference there. Yes.
When you translocate bull trout to other lakes and glacier, what are the native fish populations there, and how do they get along?
Yeah, that's a great question. My grad student, the first thing we did is to do our homework.
I'm sure.
We're like, all right, translocations in the history of humans on the landscape really hasn't been a good thing for biodiversity, right? I mean, the International Conservation Union of Scientists, they have standards where there were 3 different types of translocations, and they're all bad. They were trying to define them and saying, okay, we shouldn't be doing this anymore. We're really moving around organisms isn't a good thing for the native, organisms. But they created a 4th option, and it's called conservation introduction. And that's in a situation where under climate and other things that are of immediate threat to their persistence, you want to do something to move them to these areas of refugia so you have something left for future generations, like that gentleman asked about the bug in the high country. So my grad student, we did the homework, we created a framework. I might be getting into greater detail here than you wanted to hear, but I'm a scientist and that's the kind of geek I am. But we developed a framework that we looked at the suitability of the habitat, how good it is to support bull trout. We looked at do no harm. We obviously don't want to impact other native species, other endemics, other bugs or amphibians. We looked at where we could get fish from, and we looked at the future threats. On the fish side of things, in the logging project, there was a non-native. It turns out in the lake that we introduced them into, there's a non-native hybridized population of Yellowstone cutthroat trout and West Slope cutthroat trout. So it's got no conservation value. It's from the park's perspective. It's not the native Aboriginal cutthroat. So that was a situation where, you know, they were stocking fish back in the day. That population held on. We found no rare bugs, no rare amphibians. You know, the habitat looked good. We had some numbers left to move. The future looked good because it's those deep lakes again that are going to be cold water spots in the future. And so the managers, that's the first time that they've done something like that. And that's the only example in the Grace Lake. So next time you're hiking logging, go up to the upper logging cabin, check out all the scratch marks from the grizzly bears on the cabin, and then take a short hike up to Grace Lake and try to catch a bull trout and tell me about it. I'd love to hear
I
it.
have to say that I heard your NPR story and I was like, Sean, you're perfect for science on that. So I'm really glad that
So like assisted migration, they're doing what we know with Joshua trees, trying to move them in time because they can't keep up. Is there any talk about that with the stone flowers, trying to move them to different areas that are being glaciated as we speak, to try and keep the population going?
Yeah, you know, we haven't, there are no options in glacier. You know, where there's ice left, we find the bugs.
Could you repeat that question?
Okay, the question was, did we, oh, sorry, okay. The question was, if I understand correctly, is that have we considered assisted migration with the stoneflies? Have we looked at moving them to suitable habitats so we have something left? And the short answer is that there's no other options in glacier. They're everywhere they could be. And we have not looked at Canada yet. So that's something that might be talked about here in the near future.
Keep the species alive, it's not going to have an impact. So
Exactly. Yeah. No, we're starting those discussions. I'll keep it at that. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Gentleman has a question.
I'm sorry. Am I not? I know. Stand up.
I'm just curious your take on the whole kokanee and mysis shrimp, lake trout thing. You know, in hindsight, was it all a bad idea? Was there merit in it at some point? Or, you know, were the kokanee an invasive species in some sense? You know, what's your take on that?
Well, my take on it in terms of lake trout effects, or just in general, just ecosystem. Well, that's, I mean, you know, Jack and Bonnie and the work at the biostation has documented one of the most classic cascading trophic effects out there in science. I mean, this is a cool story, even though the ecological consequences aren't so cool. What happened was mysis were introduced into 4 lakes upstream of Flathead back in the late 70s. Fisheries managers at that time thought that the mysis, you know, they're a good source of protein. They were enhancing the growth of a lot of other recreational fisheries up in Canada, up in Kootenay Lake. And so they thought it might be a good idea to move the mysis around and stimulate the food chain, get bigger fish, you know, more of them. And so they put them into 4 lakes. They drained down to Flathead. Unfortunately, they directly competed with the native fish, and they were inaccessible to the native fish. So what happened was the mysis shrimp move up and down in the water column. At night, they're up at the top, and during the day, they're down at the bottom where the lake trout are. So for sight feeders like bull trout and cutthroat that cruise around the banks in the shallower areas, during the day, the mysis shrimp aren't available to them to eat, okay? And the second whammy in that situation was that as the mysis move up and down in the water column, they're eating all the plankton and the zooplankton that the juvenile bull trout and cutthroat need to grow and get bigger and survive and go spawn. And so it was a double whammy. They weren't accessible, and they were directly competing for a food resource. That exploded the lake trout population. You know, guess what? Who was capitalizing on that situation? The lake trout. So the lake trout population was actually there at a very low abundance since 1905. The U.S. Fisheries Commission stocked lake trout in Flathead Lake in 1905. They were at a very low abundance. When the mysis took off, lake trout exploded. They radiated out. Within 30 years, they, established populations in 9 of the 12 interconnected lakes in the park. So the situation with the lake isn't just about Flathead. It's about an entire ecosystem, a transboundary ecosystem. And looking at the range of bull trout, Glacier Park represents about 1/3 of the natural lake habitat, for bull trout throughout their range in the U.S. So it's a very important place. And the vast majority of those places now in the park aren't doing well, and they're almost functionally extinct. So I guess my long answer to your question was there's a cascading effect that went all the way up the food chain. It even affected the birds, like the eagles and the bears that were concentrating on the kokanee. The kokanee, yeah, they're non-native, but where bull trout coexist with kokanee, they use them as a food resource. So bull trout actually do really well with kokanee. Kokanee went extinct within 3 or 4 years. I mean, I've never seen something like that in my career. So it had devastating, irreversible consequences, and there's really no going back on that one. Yes?
With all your science on Flathead Lake, what happened to the Flathead Lake monster?
I don't study the lake. I mostly study the rivers.
When you're studying,
You're gonna have to ask Stanford about that. I don't know. That might have been like a funding campaign thing or something.
have you ever seen anything with the Flathead Lake monster?
We need more funding.
Yeah. There could be. We need to look. We need to do the acoustic surveys and go out there. And so if you know anyone with some, 25 million. Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Saying, no, you have never seen
I haven't seen the Flathead Lake monster. I've heard about it. I don't know. The science hasn't proven that they exist. So I'm gonna have to say I don't buy it unless the data show me.
That's what I'm looking for. And you haven't seen any?
I haven't. No. I probably haven't been around long enough.
Well, it's gotta be eating your fish.
Yeah,
That's the case.
in Kookanusa, back in the day, they moved like 4 or 5 sturgeons above Libby Dam, and there were sightings there that they thought was the Kookanusa monster.
Well, we're from Fort Peck.
Oh, okay.
So we have.
Yeah. Yes.
So while we're on the deep scientific level here, have you considered as a last resort some GMO work with bull trout and the kokanee and the cutthroat to cross with maybe a jalapeno pepper so that the predators won't like them?
The more we meddle with nature, the more harm we do, the bigger hole we dig, there's no getting out. We've got the tools now with the boats and the nets, and there's stuff on the horizon like the acoustic, sound wave technology that could burst the eggs. There's things like that. I've thought of actually using pheromonal attractants. So when fish spawn, they emit pheromones and it attracts the females in to mate. So we've talked about maybe using that as a tool to lure in the lake trout to these areas. These are fun things to think about as we're doing. A lot of the science gets done on a napkin right on that table. Some of the best. Electrofishing. Well, we can shock fish and sample them. Why can't we shock eggs and the lake trout? So that's another option. But for now, the technology really isn't there to capitalize on those thoughts, those ideas. So, it's just hanging on to do what we can now, and hopefully that technology will improve over time, and we can be more effective.
So I've heard rumor that there's a river that runs in Flathead Valley underground, and that there are blind fish that live in that river. Is there any truth to that?
I don't know about the blind fish, but there's some pretty cool rare stoneflies that Jack's been studying and his student and others that are subterranean. There is a blind amphipod in Glacier that's transparent. It lives in deep caves and it's found nowhere else. So that's a cool bug that kind of, hangs out in those deep, dark areas where, no sun shines. There's a whole host of biodiversity within the floodplain, within those aquifers. I mean, I try to make that point in that one slide. What you see on the surface water represents a third or so of the flow that's out in the floodplain. So these areas are like sponges, these broad alluvial valleys. So what happened when the glaciers receded, there's these little nick points at the valley bottom, right? Where it constricts like downstream of Polebridge. It's all low gradient and then it goes down to the canyon. Well, right there, that little constriction produces this huge like bathtub of gravel where all this groundwater comes into the system. It upwells, it creates colder water. The surface water coming in from above it is running down the stream. It goes under the ground, then it comes back up, and it gets colder again. So during the summer, those areas are colder. During the winter, they're a little warmer. So that's why there's a lot of biodiversity. And those are the areas that we see those bugs way out into the floodplain and the subterranean and flow that is infiltrating through that gravel bed river bottom. So those are super cool areas, actually. Yeah.
I just want to piggyback on, can I say?
Yeah.
I'm going to piggyback on that question because in April at Science on Tap, there's going to be 2 Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology researchers here presenting new information that they're still processing right now actually on the valley's deep aquifer and on some subsurface geology. So that'll be here in April. And
cool.
I don't know, we could ask them about the blind fish.
I haven't heard of any blind fish, but the bugs for sure. And that's not just in the Flathead Valley. That's up the North Fork, that's in the Nyack, and even in the smaller systems like Whale Creek, Trail Creek, those areas, there's those upwelling zones as well. And that's those groundwater areas that those bull trout go back to.
I just want to make a quick announcement. We have about 20 minutes left of our $1 per pint fundraiser. So if your glass is empty and you want one more, now's the time. This is absolutely what we had in mind for Science on Tap, so I'm just going to let Clint roll. He's here all night, folks.
Is the overall bull trout fishery population stable or is it on a decline?
So Jason asked, is the overall bull trout population stable or on a decline? And cutthroat. Cutthroat's pretty stable right now with the hybridization threat. The bull trout, it's a little bit variable. Historically, if we look at the entire record, it goes back to 1980 where we have data, the overall trend is declining, okay? However, recently the Middle Fork, some of those streams are looking pretty good. In contrast, in striking contrast, the North Fork, some of those trips that have been monitored year after year after year aren't looking so good, and some of the lowest on the record. So it's a little variable. And so,
environmental factors are basic.
So I think it's probably a combination of environmental conditions as well as the lake trout. Again, the bull trout, they grow to maturity in the Flathead Lake, and they come back to like Whale Creek and Trail Creek to spawn. And so, they're those kind of, and the lake's a bottleneck right now. So you can produce all the babies you want in the strips, and then when they hit the lake, if they're getting munched, well, there's very few returning. So we've seen the populations go down. I do think some of it's due to habitat, probably. We've seen that in some of our data. But I think overall, it's for conservation, for bull trout, we want to have as many local populations distributed on the landscape to ensure that that population, the meta population, persists into the future. It's like light bulbs on a Christmas tree. And when they go out, you know, they start to blink out, the overall persistence, the likelihood that that population is going to survive into the future goes down. So another answer to that is that the Glacier Park lakes aren't looking good. Those are light bulbs going out. A couple of the tribs on the other side of the river are you know, the lights going out there. So I wouldn't say it's stable. Yeah, very low compared to what, in my opinion, looking at the habitat and how protected it is and how relatively pristine it is, we've got the habitat capacity to support amazing bull trout fisheries, and there's something else going on outside those habitats, and it's the lake trout.
I have a question.
I have a question for you. Are the basal resources from an ecosystem ecology sort of perspective, are there enough basal resources to support, after all the climate change and all the invasive introductions and all the sort of manipulations that man has caused in these systems? Has there been enough emphasis, or do we know enough about basal resources in that, from algae to bugs to fish, to expect the native fisheries to be able to last as things change from the plagification or the loss of benthic habitats with increasing nutrients or increasing sediments or increasing runoff? Can you talk a little bit about the fish from an ecosystem perspective? Not so much just the conservation from climate or invasives, but what are they eating? How are they getting that energy? How are they getting those nutrients?
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, we don't know much about how climate's going to affect aquatic ecosystems. We really don't. The science is emerging right now. So my most basic answer is we don't really know. We do a lot of arm waving there. And with the fish, we key into temperature. Because they're cold water dependent, we can model temperatures, and I got a PhD student, and we can model it down very to the max. You know, it's an exact science. And then we can look at a thermal threshold and above which they don't do well at, and we can model that out in the future. It's arm waving. Can they behaviorally adapt and change things up to, you know, to change with the environment as well? I don't know. The food community dynamics, I mean, you probably know more about that than I do. And we're trying to get that in the Alpine. The Alpine's an amazing real-time environmental natural laboratory. And that's why, what we are seeing, overall biodiversity is actually increasing, but the endemics, these rare bugs, are increasing. Yeah, the gamma diversity. But loss of the endemics, so we're just not out on their stuff yet, but it's right for your research in the lake though, for sure.
In reference to the threat of hybridization between the rainbows and the cutthroats, are there phenotypic traits, are there like physical traits that have been identified as being lost when they do hybridize? Like what makes their fitness, the fitness of the cutthroats decrease when they hybridize?
What makes it decrease? Okay. So we looked at that. So what makes it decrease? So basically our studies that we looked at, the fitness consequences of hybridization, we looked at fitness in terms of the number of offspring per female. So we did, not to be all deep in this audience, I know you guys are into it, but we did paternity analysis and looked at genetic relationships between adults and their progeny. And we found that after you increase hybridization up to 20%, you see at least a 50% decline and fitness. And that's holding true across different environments. At what life stage that occurs at, we don't really know yet. Our study, we're getting at that with the study that Gordon and I are working on, that NSF project, where we're trying to identify the life stage at which that outbreeding depression, that fitness decline occurs at, so we can nail that down. I had a student, we looked at that in the lab, we didn't find much out. And I think it's just the laboratory effect relax those selective pressures that are operating in the natural realm that we're missing from that experiment. We do know though that outbreeding depression is likely results in that breakup of those co-adaptive gene complexes that are linked to those adaptive traits. So the timing and when they spawn and when they emerge and how long they hang on the creeks and when they leave. So yeah, thank you. So the signal's there, it's pretty consistent, and we're actually, Gordon and Ryan have some pretty cool genomic data sets now that show the same thing at the genomic level. So it's pretty interesting. And this is in a situation where rainbows didn't co-evolve with rustler. In other areas down in Columbia, like the inland red band trout, like up in the Coogan, they co-evolve with rustler pepper trout. You don't see that hybrid swarm formation where they co-evolve. You see it where you have these hatchery fish that have been stocked into these systems that are from these hatcheries from California and stuff, and they just don't do it in the natural environment. Whether that improves over time, that's another question. So I want to get at that. But the signal's there across different streams, different temps, different flows. So. Yeah.
So you lived in the elevator. Like on the South Fork of the Snake, one of the Yellowstone catchphrase coexisting with rainbows and the browns and everything. Is it the West Slope inability to have
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the question is, do we see the same effects of hybridization in Yellowstone cutthroat trout as you do in West Slope? Is it a West Slope? Is that right? Is it a West Slope specific effect? Interestingly, we looked at Glacier that's been extensively stocked with Yellowstone over the last, since, Creston National Fish Hatchery was developed to stock fish in Glacier Park. That was part of Glacier's fisheries operations at the time. There was another hatchery over in East Glacier. They stocked everything in the park, from Yellowstone and spotted trout to splake to Chinook salmon, to you name it, they stocked them. And so we did a big genetic inventory to see what we had left. And in areas where they stocked Yellowstones, we don't see that that hybridization spread as much. We don't. It seems like it stays put. It's contained, like up in Evangeline Lake, Trout Narrow, that complex. Evangeline's way at the top. All Yellowstone cutthroat trout. On the next lake down is Canis Lake, all Yellowstone cutthroat trout. You get down to Arrow Lake, West Slope cutthroat trout. Get down to Trout Lake, West Slope cutthroat trout. And they're connected, yeah, there's some waterfalls and stuff, but you would think that over time hybridization would take off. We're not seeing that. It's a pretty interesting situation, and I want to do more research on that. It doesn't seem to be as much of an issue with the Yellowstone and West Slope hybridization. Within the range of Yellowstone, though, yes, rainbows interbreed with Yellowstone cutthroat trout like in Yellowstone Park, and they have seen the spread of hybridization in that system. I'm on a students committee, we're looking at that in Yellowstone right now. So,
I think we're at the point now where we can converge around the table and continue discussion if that's warranted. Thank you everybody for coming. And again, we're at the point now where let's do a pretty good round of applause. That was honestly the epitome of what we want at Science on Tap. So thank you very much. kick-ass. Good. And again, please remember that there's envelopes around if you're still interested. If you're not a member of the Lakers, please look into it. And all this work that Clint's talked about, all those questions we don't know, feel free to fund the bio station to find out what we can do. Thank you very much for coming, and cheers to the lake. That's the sign-off we'll stick with. Thank you very much.